everyone and welcome to Wormwood Tales. Relax and enjoy the story for sleep video. Before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Let's begin. Before you settle into your bed tonight, I want you to do something simple but powerful. Turn off your lights, and let the room fall into complete darkness. Take a moment to feel the quiet around you. Now, as you lie back, open your eyes and look into the black screen in front of you. Let it become a doorway into the unknown. In the stillness, you'll find a world waiting for you. A world where light is a distant memory and darkness holds the answers. Take a deep breath and let go of everything around you. You're about to step into a place where the only thing that matters is what you can't see. Look into the black screen. Let it consume you. Let it follow you into sleep, and remember, it's not just a screen. It's a doorway. Now, let's begin. Dr. Evelyn Marsh was no stranger to the macabre. Her career as a historian had been built on her willingness to confront the grim and grisly truths of America's past. Where others flinched from stories of witch trials, brutal executions, or forgotten massacres, Evelyn leaned in, uncovering the fragments of history buried beneath fear and myth. Her office shelves brimmed with thick, leather-bound volumes on Salem, Gettysburg, and other haunted landmarks, each annotated with her sharp, meticulous handwriting. But there was one story she had never been able to resist: the story of the Lalaurie mansion. Nestled in the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter, the mansion stood as a chilling relic of the city's past. It was a house of contradictions, its ornate facade whispered of elegance and high society, but its legacy screamed of torment and bloodshed. The infamous Madame Delphine Lalaurie had once lived there, a celebrated socialite with a dark secret. Behind the mansion's grand doors, she had perpetrated atrocities so horrifying that even the notoriously jaded New Orleans elite were scandalized when the truth came to light. The story had all the elements of legend: a wealthy mistress with a cruel streak, a fire that uncovered the grotesque horrors hidden in the attic, and tales of anguished screams that continued to echo long after the house was abandoned. Locals avoided it, whispering that the mansion was cursed. Even paranormal investigators hesitated to enter, claiming the spirits within were unlike any they had encountered before. But Evelyn wasn't here for ghost stories. She was here for history. For years, she had pored over records of the Lalaurie estate, property deeds, personal letters, and trial transcripts. She had pieced together the cold facts behind the folklore, but there were gaps, frustrating voids where truth and legend blurred. Recently, a cache of artifacts had been uncovered during renovations on a nearby property, a collection rumored to include personal effects of the Lalaurie family. The discovery had reignited Evelyn's obsession. With painstaking effort, she had secured permission to spend a full week in the mansion itself, studying its architecture and cataloging the artifacts. When she finally arrived in New Orleans, the locals were less than welcoming. The cab driver who dropped her off refused to pull into the driveway, muttering something about bad luck. The property manager handed over the keys with a warning. "People don't stay long in there, Dr. Marsh. Whatever you're looking for, be careful. Some stories are better left buried." Evelyn dismissed the warnings with polite indifference. Superstition had no place in her work. She had spent her career unraveling the truth behind so-called haunted places. Every creaking floorboard and cold spot could be explained. The Lalaurie mansion was no different. Its horrors were human, rooted in the cruelty of a single person, not the supernatural. Or so she thought. The mansion loomed before her as she stood at the gate, its windows dark and unwelcoming. The once pristine white walls were now weathered, streaked with grime and ivy. Yet the house retained an undeniable grandeur, its ironwork balconies and towering shutters speaking of a time when it was the jewel of the French Quarter. Evelyn couldn't help but feel a twinge of awe as she stepped through the wrought iron gate and up the stone path to the door. The moment she crossed the threshold, a chill crept over her skin. She paused, brushing it off as nerves. The foyer was grand yet decaying, with a spiral staircase rising into the gloom above. Dust motes floated in the dim light filtering through stained glass windows. The air was thick, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something metallic like old blood. Her footsteps echoed as she moved further inside, her shoes clicking against the cracked marble floor. The house felt alive in its silence, as though it were waiting, watching. Evelyn shook the thought from her mind and focused on the task ahead. The first few days were uneventful. She spent hours sketching the architectural details of the parlor, dining room, and servants' quarters, marveling at the craftsmanship. She catalogued artifacts, silver combs, porcelain figurines, and fragments of letters too faded to read. At night, she slept in the guest bedroom, surrounded by her notes and equipment. But by the fourth night, the atmosphere began to shift. The house seemed darker, the air heavier. The creaks and groans of the old building grew louder, more deliberate, like footsteps just out of sight. Her dreams were restless, filled with whispers and glimpses of hollow-eyed faces. Still, Evelyn pressed on, determined to remain logical. Ghosts didn't exist. The human mind was simply prone to tricks when exposed to fear and isolation. Then she found the attic. She had nearly dismissed the narrow staircase as a closet door, but curiosity led her to climb the creaking steps into the house's hidden upper level. The attic was stifling, filled with dust and cobwebs. But as her flashlight swept across the room, she froze. Chains dangled from the ceiling beams, their rusted metal clinking faintly in the still air. Scratches marred the walls, forming illegible patterns that made her stomach turn. In the corner, something gleamed, a small, porcelain doll. Evelyn picked it up, noting its unnerving resemblance to a child. Its dress was tattered, its painted eyes staring blankly ahead. Tied around its neck was a scrap of paper, brittle with age. One word was scrawled in elegant script: "Stay." Her pulse quickened as a chill ran down her spine. This wasn't just an artifact. It was a message. But who had left it? And why did it feel like the house was holding its breath, waiting for her reaction? Evelyn was about to find out. The Lalaurie mansion stood in the heart of New Orleans, a silent witness to centuries of intrigue, decadence, and unimaginable horror. To the casual observer, it was a relic of the past, a stately building with wrought iron balconies, grand windows, and a haunting elegance that lured tourists from around the world. But to those who truly knew its history, the mansion was more than an architectural gem. It was a mausoleum of secrets, a place where the echoes of the past refused to fade. Evelyn Hart, a historian, an academic of the highest order, had no time for ghost stories or urban legends. Her life was devoted to facts, provable, tangible, indisputable facts. She had spent years dissecting the myths surrounding infamous historical sites, from Europe's haunted castles to America's eerie battlefields. But the Lalaurie mansion was different. Its grim legacy had been recounted in hushed tones for generations, stories of slaves tortured in secret chambers, apparitions roaming the halls, and a cursed air that lingered over the property like a storm cloud. Evelyn wasn't drawn to the mansion because she believed in its ghostly reputation. No, she came because she didn't. The rumors of Madame Delphine Lalaurie's atrocities were well documented in historical records, but many of the grisly details, the chains in the attic, the disfigured victims, the fires, lacked substantiation. Evelyn saw an opportunity, not for thrills, but for truth. If she could debunk the mansion's myths, she could finally bring clarity to a story distorted by centuries of sensationalism. So when the offer came to study the Lalaurie mansion up close, Evelyn accepted without hesitation. A private foundation had granted her exclusive access to the house for an entire week, a rare privilege in a city that kept the doors tightly locked. It was the perfect chance to explore the house's history without the interference of ghost hunters or thrill-seeking tourists. On the morning of her arrival, the streets of the French Quarter were alive with music and laughter, the scent of beignets and gumbo wafting through the air. But as Evelyn approached the mansion, the lively atmosphere seemed to wither. The house loomed over her like a dark sentinel, its windows reflecting the overcast sky. The tour guide, an older man with a weathered face and a thick Creole accent, met her at the gate. He gave her a knowing look as he handed her the keys. "Be careful, Miss Hart," he said. "This place, it doesn't take kindly to strangers." Evelyn brushed off his warning with a polite smile. "I'm here to study history, not ghost stories." The guide chuckled softly, shaking his head. "That's what they all say." The heavy iron gates groaned as Evelyn pushed them open, stepping into the overgrown courtyard. Vines crawled up the mansion's exterior, their tendrils clinging to the walls like skeletal fingers. The air was cooler here, almost unnaturally so, and a faint unease settled over her as she approached the front door. Inside, the mansion was eerily quiet. Dust coated the furniture, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. Evelyn's footsteps echoed in the cavernous space as she made her way through the grand foyer, taking in the spiral staircase, the crystal chandelier, and the faded wallpaper that hinted at the home's former opulence. Her first task was to set up her equipment. She had brought cameras, audio recorders, and notebooks, intending to document every corner of the mansion. The goal was to catalog the house's architectural details and compare them to historical records. But as the day wore on, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. It started with the small things, the way the chandelier swayed gently, though there was no draft, the faint sound of footsteps above her, though the upper floors were supposed to be empty. Once, she thought she heard a woman's voice humming a melody, soft and mournful, but when she called out, the sound stopped abruptly. She chalked it up to her imagination. After all, she had read enough about the mansion to fill her mind with suggestions. But as night fell, the house's oppressive atmosphere became harder to ignore. In her room, Evelyn prepared for her first night of research. She had chosen the former dining room as her base of operations, a large space with tall windows and a grand fireplace. She spread her notes across the table, lighting a few candles to supplement the dim electric light. As she worked, the creaking of the floorboards grew louder, as if someone or something was moving closer. The sound was intermittent, stopping whenever she stood to investigate. Evelyn's logical mind insisted it was nothing a structural quirk, perhaps, but her instincts screamed otherwise. At midnight, she decided to call it a night. She locked the door to the dining room and climbed the creaking staircase to the guest bedroom she had prepared. The bed was musty, and the sheets smelled faintly of mildew, but she was too tired to care. As she drifted off to sleep, Evelyn dreamed of the mansion as it had been in its heyday, bright, lively, filled with the laughter of guests and the clinking of glasses. But then the laughter turned to screams, and the bright light dimmed into shadow. In her dream, Evelyn wandered the halls, chasing whispers that seemed to beckon her deeper into the house. When she awoke, the whispers didn't stop. Evelyn Grayson had never been one to believe in ghost stories. As a historian, her life revolved around cold, hard facts, names, dates, and documented events. Her work often required sifting through centuries-old records, piecing together the lives of people who had long since faded into history. Legends and myths were fascinating, but only as cultural artifacts, not truths. That mindset had served her well throughout her career, allowing her to remain detached from the sensationalism that often surrounded her field. So, when she first heard about the infamous Lalaurie mansion, nestled in the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter, she approached it as she would any other historical site. The stories she'd read were gruesome. Madame Delphine Lalaurie, a wealthy socialite in the 1830s, was said to have lived a double life. On the surface, she was a charming hostess, throwing opulent parties for New Orleans' elite. But behind closed doors, she was a sadistic figure who inflicted unimaginable cruelty upon her enslaved servants. Rumors of torture chambers, secret experiments, and horrific deaths surrounded the mansion. There were tales of ghostly screams in the night, apparitions wandering the halls, and visitors being driven away by an overwhelming sense of dread. Evelyn dismissed much of it as exaggeration, a blend of Southern Gothic storytelling and modern urban legend. What intrigued her was not the haunting, but the mystery of Delphine herself. Who was the woman behind the stories? What drove her to such darkness? And why did the house seem to cling to its macabre reputation, refusing to fade into obscurity? When Evelyn was invited to study the mansion firsthand, she saw it as an opportunity too good to pass up. The mansion's current owner, a reclusive millionaire, had allowed her access to its private archives and the building itself. It was a historian's dream: original letters, architectural blueprints, and artifacts that had remained untouched for decades. Her colleagues warned her against going. Some spoke of cursed objects and the mansion's malevolent aura. Others pointed out the more practical dangers: an old, decaying structure could be physically unsafe. But Evelyn brushed off their concerns. She wasn't superstitious, and she had explored crumbling ruins before without issue. Arriving in New Orleans, Evelyn was immediately struck by the city's vibrant energy. The streets buzzed with music, the air thick with the scent of gumbo and beignet. Yet, as her cab approached the Lalaurie mansion, the atmosphere shifted. The building loomed on the corner of Royal Street, its facade an imposing blend of old-world elegance and undeniable eeriness. The ironwork balconies were ornate, but they cast long, jagged shadows in the late afternoon sun. The windows were dark, their glass seeming to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Evelyn felt an inexplicable chill as she stepped out of the cab. She shook it off, attributing it to the stories she'd read. The mansion was just a house, she told herself, a structure made of bricks and mortar, nothing more. The caretaker, an older man named Louis, greeted her at the door. He was gruff but polite, his eyes darting nervously as if he didn't like lingering near the mansion for too long. "You're the historian?" he asked, his voice low. "That's right. Evelyn Grayson." Louis hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the house. "You sure about this? Folks around here don't stay in that place after dark." Evelyn gave him a reassuring smile. "I'll be fine. I've done this sort of thing before." He handed her the keys without another word, muttering something under his breath that she couldn't quite catch. As the heavy door creaked open, Evelyn stepped inside. The air was cool and musty, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something else she couldn't identify, something metallic, like old blood. The grand staircase stretched upward, its banister gleaming under a layer of dust. Portraits lined the walls, their subjects' eyes seeming to follow her as she moved. Evelyn's initial impressions were practical. The mansion was a time capsule, its ornate details offering a glimpse into a bygone era. She couldn't wait to get started, to peel back the layers of history and uncover the truth. Yet, as she walked through the silent halls, an uneasy feeling began to creep in. The house felt alive, as though it were watching her. Each creak of the floorboards echoed too loudly, and the stillness was oppressive. When Evelyn reached the study, a room filled with bookshelves and a massive desk, she noticed something odd. A single book lay open on the desk, its pages yellowed with age. She leaned in to read the faded text, but as her fingers brushed the edge of the page, a sharp sound broke the silence. It was a laugh. Soft, high-pitched, and unmistakably that of a child. Evelyn spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. The room was empty. She told herself it was just her imagination, amplified by the house's unsettling atmosphere. Taking a deep breath, she returned her attention to the book. But when she looked down, the page she had been reading was blank. Frowning, she flipped through the rest of the book. Every single page was blank. Evelyn shook her head and closed the book, dismissing the incident as a trick of her mind. But as she left the study and made her way back to the parlor, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The house was silent, but it wasn't empty. Evelyn Grayson was not the type to believe in ghosts. As a historian, she prided herself on relying on facts, evidence, and verifiable records to make sense of the past. Myths and legends were distractions, embellishments added to history by those too frightened to face reality. To Evelyn, the Lalaurie mansion was no different, a building weighed down by the heavy stories of cruelty and tragedy, but still just a building. When she first received the invitation to conduct an extensive historical survey of the mansion, Evelyn saw it as a career-defining opportunity. Nestled in the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter, the mansion was a masterpiece of 19th-century architecture and a grim reminder of the city's complex and often troubling history. Tales of Madame Delphine Lalaurie's horrific treatment of enslaved people were infamous, but Evelyn had always seen them as part of a broader cultural narrative, a way for society to grapple with the horrors of the past. Her assignment was clear: catalog the architectural details, examine any surviving artifacts, and cross-reference the findings with historical records. The idea thrilled her. So much of the mansion's history was buried under layers of lore and ghost stories. What better way to separate truth from fiction than to spend a week living and working inside the notorious house? The morning she arrived, the mansion loomed before her like a relic of another time. Its wrought iron balconies were covered in creeping vines, and the pale stucco walls had begun to crumble, revealing the bricks beneath. The windows, dark and reflective, seemed to watch her as she approached. Evelyn dismissed the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. This was just another job. Her car was packed with everything she needed: books, scanning equipment, a portable desk, and plenty of coffee to keep her awake through long nights of research. The caretaker, an elderly man named Mr. Duval, met her at the gate. His face was lined with age, his eyes shadowed by something Evelyn couldn't quite place. He unlocked the gate with a rusted key, his hands trembling slightly. "You're brave to take this on, Miss Grayson," he said, his voice a low rasp. Evelyn smiled politely. "I'm just here for the history, Mr. Duval. Nothing more." "History," he muttered, shaking his head. "This house doesn't just hold history, you know. It holds onto it. You be careful in there." She thanked him and stepped inside, lugging her equipment through the grand entrance. The double doors creaked open, revealing a grand foyer. Dust motes floated lazily in the dim light streaming through a stained glass window. The air was thick with the smell of aged wood and mildew, and the sound of her footsteps echoed in the cavernous space. Despite the mansion's decay, its beauty was undeniable. The sweeping staircase, the marble floors, and the intricate plasterwork on the ceilings hinted at the opulence of its past. Evelyn felt a flicker of excitement. This place was a treasure trove, and she couldn't wait to dive into its secrets. She began her work immediately, starting with the first floor parlor. The room was filled with antique furniture draped in white sheets, giving it the appearance of a ghostly gathering. She removed the coverings carefully, revealing hand-carved tables and chairs, a grand piano with yellowed keys, and a massive fireplace with a cracked mantel. As she catalogued each item, Evelyn couldn't ignore the strange sensation of being watched. It was subtle at first: a prickle at the back of her neck, a shadow she thought she saw out of the corner of her eye. She chalked it up to nerves. She was alone in an enormous, creaking house. Of course, her imagination would try to fill the silence. But by the second night, the unease grew harder to dismiss. Evelyn had set up her workstation in the library, a room filled with dusty books and dark wooden shelves that stretched to the ceiling. She was reviewing architectural sketches of the mansion when she heard a soft, rhythmic tapping. She froze, her pen hovering over her notebook. The sound was faint but distinct, coming from somewhere above her. It wasn't the random creaking of an old house settling. It was deliberate, like footsteps. Evelyn set her pen down and listened, her heart pounding. The tapping stopped abruptly. She shook her head, annoyed at herself for letting her nerves get the better of her. She returned to her work, but the sound came again, louder this time, as if something or someone was pacing the floor above her. Curiosity outweighed fear. Grabbing her flashlight, Evelyn made her way upstairs. The grand staircase groaned under her weight, and her flashlight cast long, shifting shadows across the walls. The second-floor hallway was lined with doors, each leading to a room filled with relics of the past. She followed the sound to a small bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and as she pushed it open, the tapping ceased. The room was empty, save for a canopy bed draped in tattered linens and a dresser with a cracked mirror. Evelyn's flashlight swept the room, but there was no sign of anyone or anything that could have made the noise. A chill ran down her spine as she noticed something on the dresser, a single porcelain doll, its face cracked and its painted eyes staring directly at her. The Lalaurie mansion stood like a sentinel of despair in the heart of New Orleans, its shutters tightly closed, its facade eerily pristine despite centuries of whispered horrors. Tourists often lingered outside, snapping photos from a safe distance, while locals quickened their pace as they passed, unwilling to meet the house's blank, unfeeling gaze. For decades, the stories of Madame Delphine Lalaurie and her mansion of horrors had been shrouded in macabre fascination. Accounts of tortured souls, gruesome discoveries, and restless spirits had turned the house into a forbidden icon of terror. Most dismissed the tales as exaggerations, the embellished fabrications of an era prone to sensationalism. But for Evelyn Cartwright, a historian specializing in Southern antebellum architecture, the Lalaurie mansion represented something entirely different. Evelyn wasn't a thrill seeker or a paranormal enthusiast. Her life was devoted to facts, documents, and the meticulous process of uncovering the truth buried in history's layers. When she received a grant to study historical homes of the South, the mansion became an irresistible challenge not for its ghosts, but for its unanswered questions. The building itself was an architectural enigma, its construction steeped in secrecy, and its preservation defied logic. The opportunity came unexpectedly, through a reclusive benefactor who granted Evelyn rare, unaccompanied access to the mansion. The offer was almost too good to be true, a month to explore its interior, catalog its artifacts, and unravel its architectural mysteries. Evelyn arrived at the mansion on an overcast morning, her car loaded with research equipment, cameras, notebooks, and scanning tools. The sight of the house up close made her pause. It wasn't the building's infamous history that unsettled her but its aura of profound stillness. The wrought iron gates, the intricately designed balconies, and the dull sheen of the windows seemed frozen in time, as though the house existed in a realm separate from the bustling world around it. The tour guide who handed her the keys was an older man, his face lined with years of wary experience. "You'll be staying inside?" he asked, his tone disbelieving. Evelyn nodded. "It's the best way to document everything thoroughly." The man hesitated, gripping the keys tightly before finally handing them over. "If you hear anything strange, ignore it. Don't go looking for trouble. And for heaven's sake, don't stay past midnight." Evelyn smiled politely, dismissing his warning as the superstition of someone too close to the folklore. But as she crossed the threshold, the air seemed to change. It was colder inside, with an almost imperceptible hum, like a distant vibration she couldn't quite place. The first few days were uneventful, filled with cataloging furniture, photographing the intricate woodwork, and marveling at the craftsmanship of the era. Evelyn quickly became immersed in her work, her initial unease fading as she uncovered small, fascinating details. Hidden compartments in the walls revealed antique trinkets, lockets, pocket watches, and even a child's shoe, all untouched by time. The journals, however, were the real treasure. Found in a concealed alcove near the attic, they chronicled the life of the mansion's occupants, including Madame Lalaurie herself. Most entries were ordinary, but as Evelyn dug deeper, she discovered gaps in the timeline, months and even years with no written record. It was as if entire portions of the mansion's history had been deliberately erased. On her third evening, Evelyn decided to investigate the basement, a section of the house notorious for its alleged ties to Madame Lalaurie's most sinister deeds. Descending the narrow, creaking staircase, she felt the air grow heavier with each step. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, its stone walls damp and its floors uneven. At first, it seemed like any other neglected cellar. Shelves lined with dusty jars, old furniture draped in cobwebs, and a faint, musty smell. But in the far corner, partially concealed by debris, Evelyn discovered a doorway. The door itself was made of iron, its surface etched with strange symbols that looked neither decorative nor practical. Her pulse quickened as she examined the markings. They didn't match any architectural or artistic styles she had studied, and their meaning eluded her. But what truly unnerved her was the padlock that secured the door. It was old, but not ancient, a modern addition meant to keep someone, or something, out. Evelyn's academic curiosity burned brighter than her apprehension. She left the basement that night determined to uncover what lay behind the iron door. The journals hinted at hidden spaces and secrets, but no specific mention of this door had surfaced in her research. That night, as she reviewed her notes in the dim glow of her desk lamp, she heard it for the first time, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. It was coming from the direction of the basement. Evelyn froze, her pen hovering over the page. She told herself it was the house settling or perhaps an animal scurrying in the walls. But the sound continued, growing louder and more insistent, until it stopped abruptly. A moment later, the lamp flickered, plunging the room into near darkness. Evelyn's heart raced as she fumbled for her flashlight. When the light finally steadied, she noticed something on the desk, a doll. She hadn't brought it there. The doll was porcelain, its face cracked, its eyes unnervingly lifelike. Clutched in its tiny hands was a piece of folded paper. With trembling fingers, Evelyn unfolded the note. The handwriting was unfamiliar but elegant, the words chillingly direct. "Open the door." Evelyn's breath hitched. She looked around the room, half expecting to see someone watching her. But she was alone. At least, she thought she was. Evelyn Cartwright wasn't the kind of historian who believed in ghost stories. To her, the Lalaurie mansion was less a haunted house and more an unsolved mystery of history, its horrific past buried under layers of speculation, hearsay, and myth. That was what drew her to New Orleans, a city rich with folklore, where every corner seemed to have a tale waiting to be told. The Lalaurie mansion, however, was different. It wasn't just another stop on the tourist circuit, it was a place that carried the weight of unspeakable crimes, its very walls steeped in suffering. Stories of Madame Delphine Lalaurie's cruelty were infamous: enslaved people tortured in secret, their lives extinguished in unimaginable pain. But beyond the horror, Evelyn saw an academic opportunity. For years, the mansion had been off limits to thorough investigation. Rumors swirled about its current owner, a reclusive figure who refused to open the doors to anyone. But Evelyn's reputation as a meticulous researcher had earned her a rare invitation. The conditions were strict: she would have exactly 1 week to study the property, with no interruptions and no assistance. It was an offer she couldn't refuse. Evelyn arrived at the mansion on a humid Monday morning, her car loaded with notebooks, cameras, and recording devices. The wrought iron gates creaked as they swung open, revealing the imposing structure beyond. The house was a towering relic of antebellum architecture, its once brilliant white facade now weathered and gray. Ivy crept along the walls, as if nature itself was trying to reclaim it. She stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the cracked cobblestones of the driveway. As she approached the front door, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Her eyes darted to the upper windows, but they were dark, the curtains drawn tight. The caretaker, a wiry man named Charles, met her at the door. His face was lined with age, his eyes darting nervously as he handed her the keys. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "This place has a way of getting under your skin." Evelyn offered a polite smile. "I'll be fine. Thank you for your concern." Charles hesitated, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before stepping back. "Just remember," he said, You're not the first to come here looking for answers. Most don't leave with what they're looking for." With that ominous warning, he disappeared down the cobblestone path, leaving Evelyn alone. The interior of the mansion was even more unsettling than she had anticipated. The air was thick, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something metallic, iron, perhaps. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners like forgotten memories. The grand staircase dominated the foyer, its mahogany banister gleaming despite the years of neglect. Evelyn set to work immediately, her academic curiosity outweighing any unease she felt. She began by photographing the architectural details, marveling at the craftsmanship. The intricate carvings on the woodwork depicted strange, almost grotesque faces, details she hadn't seen in any of her preliminary research. As she moved from room to room, she jotted down notes about the layout and design. The parlor was elegant, its ceiling adorned with a delicate plaster medallion. The dining room featured a massive fireplace, its hearth cold and empty. But it was the upstairs bedrooms that unsettled her the most. The rooms were sparse, their furnishings stripped away long ago. Yet, the air felt heavier here, as if the walls themselves were bearing witness to something unseen. In one of the bedrooms, Evelyn found a mirror hanging on the wall. It was cracked, its silver backing tarnished with age. As she peered into it, she thought she saw a movement behind her, just a flicker, like a shadow passing. She turned quickly, but the room was empty. Shaking off the feeling, she continued her exploration. By the time night fell, Evelyn had catalogued most of the ground floor and part of the second. She set up her laptop and began organizing her findings, her fingers flying over the keyboard. The hours passed quickly, and soon it was well past midnight. That was when she heard it. A faint tapping sound, coming from above her. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate, like someone pacing on the floorboards. Evelyn froze, her hands hovering over the keyboard. The mansion was supposed to be empty. She grabbed her flashlight and crept toward the staircase. The beam of light illuminated the wooden steps, each one groaning under her weight as she ascended. The tapping grew louder, leading her toward the attic. The door to the attic was ajar, its hinges squealing as she pushed it open. The room was filled with shadows, her flashlight casting eerie shapes on the walls. Boxes and old furniture were stacked haphazardly, and the air was thick with dust. In the center of the room stood a single chair. Resting on the chair was a child's porcelain doll, its face cracked and one of its glass eyes missing. Evelyn's stomach tightened as she approached. Something about the doll felt wrong, as though it didn't belong here. As she reached out to touch it, she noticed a note tucked beneath its tiny hands. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. "Leave while you still can." Evelyn's breath hitched. She spun around, half expecting to see someone watching her. But the attic was empty. The tapping sound began again, louder this time, echoing from the far corner of the attic. Evelyn shined her flashlight in the direction of the noise, but there was nothing there, only the wall. That was when she noticed it. The wall wasn't solid. A faint outline of a door was visible, its edges barely discernible in the dim light. Evelyn approached cautiously, her fingers tracing the outline. She pressed against it, and with a soft creak, the hidden door swung open. The darkness beyond was absolute, and the air that wafted out was icy cold. Evelyn hesitated, her heart racing. She knew she should turn back, but her curiosity was insatiable. She stepped through the door, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the blackness. And the door slammed shut behind her. Evelyn Harper wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. A historian by trade, her world was one of documented facts, meticulously cited sources, and a relentless pursuit of the truth. Legends, she often said, were the tools of storytellers, not scholars. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the artistry of a well-spun tale, it was simply that myths had a way of muddying the waters of history. And nowhere was that muddier than in the case of the Lalaurie mansion. For decades, the mansion in the heart of New Orleans had stood as an architectural marvel and a cautionary tale. Tourists flocked to the wrought iron gates, cameras in hand, eager to hear tales of the infamous Madame Delphine Lalaurie, a woman whose cruelty had allegedly scarred the very walls of her opulent home. Guides spun tales of tortured souls, hidden chambers, and strange noises in the dead of night. Evelyn had heard the stories many times before, often dismissed with a knowing smirk. Urban legends, she'd say to her colleagues. The truth is always less dramatic. And yet, as she stood before the mansion's imposing facade for the first time, she couldn't deny the chill that crept down her spine. The building loomed, its once grand exterior now weathered and worn by time. The black shutters hung unevenly, and the ivy that clung to the stone seemed almost alive, twisting and curling as if trying to smother the structure. Even in the warm light of the afternoon, the mansion seemed to cast its own shadow, a darkness that no sunlight could penetrate. Evelyn tightened her grip on her satchel, reminding herself why she was there. Her research into New Orleans antebellum history had led her to a treasure trove of untapped records, property deeds, letters, and financial ledgers that painted a picture of Delphine Lalaurie as more than just the villain of ghost stories. Evelyn believed there was a deeper story, one of ambition, power, and tragedy hidden beneath the sensationalized accounts. As part of an exclusive agreement with the mansion's current owners, she had been granted unprecedented access to the property for 3 nights. 3 nights to sift through its history, to separate fact from fiction, to uncover the truth about the woman who had haunted the city's collective memory for over a century. She adjusted her glasses and stepped through the gate, her heels clicking against the cobblestones. The caretaker, an older man named Arthur, greeted her with a nod. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice roughened by years of smoking. "Didn't expect someone like you to take an interest in this place. Most folks come for the scares, not the history." "I'm not most folks," Evelyn replied, her tone clipped but polite. Arthur's expression darkened. "Well, just remember this house doesn't play nice. If you start feeling strange, don't ignore it. Seen too many people come through here thinking they're tougher than they are. This place has a way of getting under your skin." Evelyn brushed off his warning with a practiced smile. "I'll be fine, Mr. Arthur. I'm here for the archives, not the theatrics." Arthur shrugged, muttering something under his breath as he unlocked the heavy oak door. The hinges groaned in protest, and Evelyn was hit with the scent of aged wood and something faintly metallic. The interior was a time capsule of decadence and decay. Crystal chandeliers hung precariously, their brilliance dulled by a thick layer of dust. Faded wallpaper peeled at the edges, revealing hints of older patterns beneath. The grand staircase, once the centerpiece of the foyer, bore scars from decades of neglect. "Here's your key," Arthur said, handing her an old-fashioned skeleton key. "You'll be on your own after sunset. I lock up and don't come back till morning. You need anything, well," he paused, his gaze lingering on her face. "Just don't go looking for trouble." Evelyn thanked him and watched as he left, his footsteps fading into the distance. The silence that followed was absolute, pressing against her ears like a physical weight. She shook it off and set to work. Her first few hours in the mansion were uneventful. She photographed documents, catalogued items of interest, and marveled at the craftsmanship of the furniture and fixtures. It wasn't until dusk that she began to notice the subtle peculiarities. The air seemed to grow colder, though the thermostat remained constant. The soft ticking of a clock echoed through the halls, but when Evelyn went to investigate, she found no clock in sight. Her footsteps, once the only sound in the house, now seemed to be accompanied by faint echoes as if someone else were walking just out of sight. By the time night fell, the mansion had taken on an entirely different character. The shadows lengthened, stretching across the floor like grasping hands. The flickering light of her desk lamp cast strange, shifting shapes on the walls. Evelyn found herself glancing over her shoulder more often than she cared to admit. Still, she pressed on. She was here for the truth, and the truth didn't hide in the light. It was near midnight when she discovered the first real anomaly. While sorting through a box of documents in the library, she found a folded sheet of parchment wedged between the pages of a ledger. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably Delphine's. To those who read this, beware the truth. Some things are not meant to be unearthed. Evelyn frowned, her fingers tracing the elegant script. It was a strange thing for a woman like Delphine to write deliberately cryptic, almost theatrical. She wondered if it had been planted as part of the mansion's macabre reputation. But as she read it again, the words seemed to shift on the page, rearranging themselves into something entirely different. They are watching you. A gust of cold air swept through the room, scattering her papers. Evelyn jumped, her pulse quickening. She looked around, half expecting to see someone standing behind her, but the room was empty. The mansion was silent again, but it wasn't the comforting silence of solitude. It was the kind of silence that feels alive, that holds its breath and waits. Evelyn steadied herself, determined not to let the house or her imagination get the better of her. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer alone. The Lalaurie mansion stood in the heart of New Orleans like a grim sentinel, its iron-laced balconies and tall windows an imposing reminder of the city's darker history. Tourists often flocked to the French Quarter to marvel at its haunted allure, snapping photos from a safe distance and swapping ghost stories in hushed tones. But few dared to enter, and even fewer lingered long enough to understand why the house earned its dreadful reputation. For Evelyn Mercer, a historian with a deep fascination for antebellum architecture, the mansion wasn't just a relic of the past, it was an enigma she couldn't ignore. Where others saw horror, she saw opportunity. The rumors of Madame Delphine Lalaurie's atrocities had always intrigued her, but as an academic, Evelyn was skeptical of the more fantastical claims, whispers of vengeful spirits, blood-stained walls, and an endless loop of screams echoing through the night. Her career had been built on unraveling myths to uncover the truth, and the Lalaurie mansion was the ultimate challenge. After years of poring over historical records, diaries, and articles, Evelyn finally received a rare invitation to access the mansion's interior. It was an opportunity few had ever been granted. The property's reclusive current owner, a shadowy figure who preferred anonymity, had agreed to a 2-week research stay, provided Evelyn signed a strict non-disclosure agreement. Evelyn had hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. She told herself it was the find of a lifetime. The chance to document the architecture and uncover untold stories about one of the South's most infamous residences was too good to pass up. The first time she saw the mansion up close, Evelyn couldn't help but shudder. The wrought iron gates groaned as they opened, the rusted hinges resisting, as if warning her to stay out. The air seemed to change as she stepped onto the property, heavier, colder, despite the balmy Louisiana evening. Standing before the grand facade, she marveled at its duality. In the daylight, the mansion was a crumbling beauty, a testament to a bygone era of opulence. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows crept across its surface, transforming it into something sinister. The caretaker, a wiry man named Joseph with a clipped Cajun accent, met her at the door. He handed her a single brass key and muttered under his breath, "Keep your wits about you in there. This house has a mind of its own." Evelyn dismissed the remark as local superstition, nodding politely before stepping inside. The interior was just as she imagined, grand but decayed. Crystal chandeliers hung precariously from cracked ceilings, and faded wallpaper peeled away in long strips, revealing the bones of the house beneath. The scent of mildew mingled with something faintly metallic like rusted iron or dried blood. Evelyn set down her equipment in the parlor and began her work immediately. Her primary focus was the mansion's architectural history, but she couldn't ignore the legends tied to it. She had reviewed countless accounts of Madame Lalaurie's cruelty, accounts of enslaved people tortured in the attic, of a fire that revealed hidden horrors, and of a mob storming the house in righteous fury. The records, though, were inconsistent, riddled with contradictions and embellishments. Some claimed the fire was started by an enslaved woman seeking escape, others suggested it was an accident. Even Madame Lalaurie herself was a mystery. Was she a sadistic monster, or a misunderstood woman caught in the web of a city's gossip? Evelyn was determined to strip away the folklore and get to the truth. On her first night, she sat at her desk in the parlor, poring over blueprints and historical maps of the property. Every detail fascinated her: the hidden passageways, the unusually thick walls, and the rooms with no clear purpose. She couldn't help but wonder what secrets the mansion held, what stories had been sealed away behind its walls. But as the hours passed, Evelyn began to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything she could explain, just a sense that she wasn't alone. The house creaked and groaned around her, the sounds too deliberate to be mere settling. She glanced over her shoulder more than once, certain she'd seen movement in her peripheral vision. The darkness seemed to press closer, the shadows stretching and shifting in ways that defied logic. Determined to shake the feeling, she turned her attention to a box of artifacts she'd uncovered in a storage closet earlier that day. Among the items was a brass hand mirror, its surface tarnished with age. Evelyn tilted it toward the light, trying to make out the faint etching on its handle. In the dim reflection, she thought she saw something move behind her, a faint outline of a figure standing in the doorway. Her breath caught, and she spun around, the mirror slipping from her hands and shattering on the floor. The room was empty. Evelyn laughed nervously, telling herself it was just her imagination. The mansion was old and full of drafts, shadows could play tricks on the eyes. Still, she couldn't shake the unease that settled over her like a second skin. She cleaned up the broken glass, her hands trembling slightly, and decided to call it a night. As she climbed the grand staircase to her room, she felt the weight of the house pressing down on her. The air grew colder with each step, and the sense of being watched intensified. When she reached the second-floor landing, she hesitated. The long hallway stretched before her, the doors to each room closed tight. Her room was the last on the left, but as she made her way down the hall, she swore she heard footsteps behind her, soft, measured, and deliberate. Evelyn turned, but there was no one there. She hurried into her room, locking the door behind her. She told herself it was just the house playing tricks again, her nerves fraying under the weight of long hours and too much caffeine. But as she lay in bed, staring at the ornate ceiling above her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Somewhere in the distance, a faint sound echoed through the mansion, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come from just outside her door. Evelyn held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, the tapping stopped. Evelyn Cartwright was not one to believe in ghosts. Her world revolved around the tangible, the concrete evidence of the past recorded in stone, ink, and wood. A decorated historian and scholar, she had spent her career unraveling the mysteries of forgotten civilizations, piecing together stories from ancient ruins and yellowed manuscripts. She had been to haunted castles in Scotland, desolate battlefields in Eastern Europe, and forgotten graveyards in her home state of Louisiana. Yet never once had she encountered anything that couldn't be explained by logic or historical context. Her latest project, however, promised to test even her unwavering skepticism. The Lalaurie mansion in New Orleans had been a source of local legend and macabre fascination for nearly 2 centuries. Tales of Madame Delphine Lalaurie's cruelty and the horrors she inflicted on her enslaved servants had been passed down through generations, whispered among locals and sensationalized by visitors. Despite the mansion's grim reputation, Evelyn saw it as an unparalleled opportunity. Her academic focus had always been on understanding the intersection of history and myth, and the Lalaurie mansion was a perfect case study. Beneath the folklore, there was real history, records of a prominent Creole socialite, accounts of her luxurious parties, and the horrifying details of the fire that had exposed her dark secrets to the world. When the Historic Society granted her special permission to study the mansion, she couldn't contain her excitement. The chance to explore its uncharted nooks and crannies, to unearth documents or artifacts untouched by the passage of time, was a dream come true. The mansion had been closed to the public for years, its eerie facade standing as a silent reminder of its gruesome past. Now, for the first time, Evelyn would be granted access not only to its infamous rooms but also to its unpublished archives. Purely academic, she reminded herself as she stepped out of her car, staring up at the looming structure. The mansion was imposing in person, its wrought iron balconies draped with vines and its windows dark and lifeless. The once vibrant white paint had dulled to a sickly gray, and the air around it seemed unnaturally still. She brushed off the chill that ran down her spine, attributing it to the brisk evening breeze. History was her domain, not superstition. Her job was to sift through the mansion's layers of truth and fiction, to separate fact from legend. If she was lucky, she might even uncover something groundbreaking, an artifact or a diary entry that had eluded previous researchers. The caretaker, a wiry man named Bernard, met her at the door. He was a man of few words, his voice gruff and his manner curt. "This place has a way of getting under your skin," he warned as he handed her the keys. "Don't stay too long at night. And don't go digging where you're not welcome." Evelyn raised an eyebrow but chose not to comment. She had heard similar warnings in other places she had worked. Superstitions ran deep in old towns like New Orleans, and she had no intention of letting them distract her. As she crossed the threshold, the air inside the mansion was cool and damp, carrying the scent of age and neglect. The grand staircase rose before her, its wooden banisters polished smooth by the hands of countless residents and visitors. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the faint outlines of long-removed paintings left ghostly impressions on the surface. Evelyn's eyes were immediately drawn to the details, the intricate carvings on the woodwork, the delicate etchings on the window panes. The mansion was a masterpiece of antebellum architecture, a testament to the wealth and status of its original owners. It was easy to see why it had been considered one of the grandest homes in New Orleans. She began her exploration methodically, moving from room to room with her notebook and camera in hand. The parlor, with its cracked marble fireplace and faded velvet drapes, hinted at the opulence of a bygone era. The dining room, dominated by a long, dust-covered table, seemed frozen in time, as though the echoes of lavish dinners still lingered in the air. But it was the upstairs bedrooms that gave her pause. There was something unsettling about the empty cribs in the nursery, the faint scratches on the floorboards near the windows. In one corner, she found a rocking chair that still swayed faintly, though there was no breeze. Her academic curiosity burned brighter than her unease. She documented everything meticulously, determined to capture every detail. She wanted to understand not just the physical structure of the mansion but also the lives of the people who had once called it home. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the rooms, Evelyn set up her workspace in the parlor. She unfolded a map of the mansion and began cross-referencing it with the architectural blueprints she had obtained from the Historic Society. That's when she noticed it, a section of the house that didn't match the blueprints. It was a small area behind the kitchen, marked only as storage on the map. But the dimensions didn't align. It was too large for a simple storage space, and its location seemed oddly concealed. A thrill of discovery coursed through her. This was why she had come to uncover the hidden layers of history. Grabbing her flashlight, she made her way to the kitchen. The storage area was exactly where the map indicated, but the entrance was concealed behind a false wall. It took her several minutes to find the mechanism that unlocked it, a hidden latch disguised as part of the cabinetry. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Evelyn hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. As she descended, the air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. The staircase led to a small, Stone-walled chamber filled with objects that defied explanation, rusted chains bolted to the walls, bloodstains that had seeped deep into the stone floor, and shelves lined with jars containing unidentifiable substances. In the center of the room was a single chair, its wooden frame splintered and its surface darkened with age. Evelyn felt a shiver of unease but forced herself to take notes, her pen scratching against the paper. This was history, raw, unfiltered, and undeniable. Little did she know, she had just uncovered a part of the mansion's story that was never meant to be found. Dr. Evelyn Harper's name carried weight in the academic world. A historian specializing in antebellum architecture, she had spent decades piecing together the stories hidden in the stones of America's oldest structures. For her, history was not just a series of dates and events, it was a living, breathing narrative that connected the past to the present. But nothing in her career had prepared her for the mystery of the Lalaurie mansion. It began with a letter hand-delivered and unsigned. The envelope was old and weathered, sealed with red wax in a style that hadn't been used in over a century. Inside was a single sheet of paper, its edges frayed and its surface faintly stained, as though it had been handled many times before. Dr. Harper. The Lalaurie mansion holds secrets that no book can capture. If you truly seek the past, come to New Orleans. The answers await you in the house itself. There was no name, no signature, just an address scribbled hastily at the bottom. Evelyn's first instinct was to dismiss it as a prank. Over the years, she had received her fair share of odd requests and letters from eccentric enthusiasts. But something about this one nagged at her. The tone was neither pleading nor boastful, it was a challenge. Evelyn tried to forget about the letter, burying herself in her current research on Civil War-era plantations. But the mansion's name gnawed at the edges of her mind. The infamous Lalaurie mansion, a site steeped in legend and horror, had long been considered a black mark on New Orleans' storied history. Built in the early 1830s, it was once the grand home of Madame Delphine Lalaurie, a socialite whose charm masked a monstrous cruelty. For decades, tales of tortured slaves, hidden chambers, and spectral apparitions had surrounded the mansion. It had changed hands countless times, each new owner fleeing under mysterious circumstances. It was said that the house itself rejected those who tried to claim it. Evelyn had always dismissed these stories as exaggerated folklore. She was a scholar, not a ghost hunter, and her field demanded evidence, not superstition. Yet the letter's arrival felt like a summons, as though the house itself was calling her. Days turned into weeks, and Evelyn found herself drawn to the idea of visiting the mansion. It wasn't just the morbid curiosity that had driven so many others, it was the potential for discovery. The Lalaurie mansion was more than a haunted house, it was a historical enigma. Who better to unravel its secrets than someone with her expertise? Finally, unable to resist the pull any longer, Evelyn booked a flight to New Orleans. She told herself it was just another research trip, another chance to document a historic property. But deep down, she felt the weight of the decision. This was different. When she arrived in New Orleans, the city was alive with its usual blend of vibrancy and mystery. The French Quarter, with its cobblestone streets and wrought iron balconies, was a historian's dream. Evelyn spent her first day walking the streets, visiting archives, and speaking with locals. Most were hesitant to discuss the Lalaurie mansion, their faces darkening at the mention of its name. "You're better off staying away," warned an elderly shopkeeper as she wrapped a packet of beignets. "That house doesn't let anyone leave the same." Evelyn brushed off the warnings, attributing them to superstition and local lore. But that night, as she sat in her hotel room reviewing her notes, she found herself unable to focus. The letter lay on the desk beside her, its words seeming to shimmer in the dim light. The next morning, Evelyn stood before the mansion. It loomed over the street, its tall, shuttered windows like blind eyes staring into the distance. The iron gates were rusted, the garden overgrown, but the structure itself was imposing, a testament to the wealth and power of its original owner. She hesitated for a moment, clutching her satchel tightly. Her rational mind told her to turn back, to treat this as just another story to add to her collection. But something deeper pushed her forward. The door creaked open as if expecting her, and Evelyn stepped inside. The air was cold, far colder than it should have been for a Louisiana summer. Dust motes floated in the faint beams of sunlight that filtered through the cracked shutters. The grand staircase spiraled upward, its mahogany banister worn smooth by decades of hands. Evelyn felt an odd sense of déjà vu, as though she had walked these halls before. She dismissed the thought and set to work, unpacking her materials and beginning her survey of the mansion. But even as she examined the ornate details and sketched the floor plan, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. In the parlor, she found the first strange clue: a fireplace that didn't belong. Its design was mismatched with the rest of the house, as though it had been hastily installed. She knelt to inspect it closer, running her fingers along the soot-stained bricks. A faint, acrid smell wafted up, and for a moment, Evelyn thought she heard whispers, soft, unintelligible, just at the edge of hearing. She jerked back, her heart racing. "Just the wind," she muttered, shaking her head. But as she moved to the next room, she found another oddity: a narrow door set into the wall, almost invisible. It was locked, but the hinges were old and brittle. Evelyn made a note to return to it later. By the time the sun set, Evelyn had explored most of the main floor, cataloging the architectural details and anomalies. But her unease had grown steadily throughout the day. The house seemed to hum with a quiet tension, as though it was waiting for something. That night, as Evelyn sat in the dim light of her desk lamp, she reviewed her findings. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the letter, the mysterious invitation that had brought her here. Who had sent it, and why? Before she could ponder further, a sound broke the silence: a faint creak from the hallway, like the weight of a footstep. Evelyn froze, her pen hovering over the page. "Hello," she called out, her voice steady but strained. There was no response, just the quiet groan of the house settling. Evelyn shook her head, forcing a laugh. "It's just an old house," she told herself. "Old houses make noise." But as she turned back to her notes, the air seemed to grow colder, and the whispers returned. This time, they were clearer, closer. And they were calling her name. Evelyn Hammond's first day at the Lalaurie mansion was uneventful, much to her relief. The historian, driven purely by professional curiosity, dismissed the mansion's reputation as the stuff of folklore. She was here to uncover facts, not to indulge in ghost stories. Armed with her notebooks, voice recorder, and camera, Evelyn began her exploration of the infamous property. Each room seemed steeped in history, from the opulent ballrooms where Madame Lalaurie had entertained New Orleans elite to the servants' quarters hidden behind the grand facade. Evelyn marveled at the intricate details of the architecture, her academic detachment shielding her from the unsettling quiet that filled the house. The first oddity was subtle, the distinct scent of lavender that wafted through the halls. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was strange for a house abandoned for decades. She dismissed it as residual from old furniture polish or perhaps her imagination. After all, she had read accounts that Madame Lalaurie favored lavender in her perfumes. But by the evening, Evelyn couldn't ignore the oppressive atmosphere. The sun dipped below the horizon, and with it, the mansion seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, the shadows deeper. It was as though the house itself was breathing, watching her every move. Undeterred, Evelyn set up her workstation in the parlor. The room was large, with high ceilings and an ornate chandelier that still hung precariously above. She spread her documents across the mahogany table, her lamp casting a warm glow over her notes. Hours passed as she catalogued the accounts of Lalaurie's atrocities, cross-referencing them with historical records. The clock struck midnight, its chime resonating through the empty house. Evelyn stretched, her focus waning, when she heard it: a faint creak, like a footstep, coming from the second floor. She froze, her pen hovering above the page. "It's just the house settling," she muttered, her voice echoing in the stillness. But then it came again, louder this time. Creak. Creak. The deliberate rhythm of someone or something moving overhead. Evelyn's logical mind wrestled with her growing unease. She grabbed her flashlight and cautiously ascended the staircase, her footsteps soft against the worn wood. The second floor was even darker than the first, the moonlight barely filtering through the dust-covered windows. "Hello," she called out, her voice firm despite her pounding heart. The only response was silence. Evelyn swept her flashlight across the hallway, the beam illuminating faded wallpaper and closed doors. She moved toward the source of the noise, a door at the far end of the corridor, slightly ajar. Her pulse quickened as she pushed it open. The room was empty, save for a few pieces of decaying furniture and a large mirror leaning against the wall. She stepped inside, her reflection flickering in the glass as her flashlight passed over it. And then she saw it. For a split second, the reflection in the mirror wasn't her own. It was a woman, her face pale and expressionless, dressed in a dark gown. Evelyn spun around, but the room was empty. She shone her flashlight into the corners, her breaths coming in short gasps. "Get a grip," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're imagining things." Evelyn hurried back to the parlor, determined to focus on her work. She tried to write, but her hands shook, the pen slipping across the page. The scent of lavender returned, stronger this time, and with it, the faint sound of a piano. She glanced toward the far corner of the room, where a grand piano sat shrouded in a dusty cover. The keys were untouched, yet the haunting melody continued. "Is someone there?" Evelyn demanded, standing abruptly. The music stopped. Heart pounding, she approached the piano, lifting the cover. The keys were pristine, untouched by time. She pressed one tentatively, the note ringing out sharply in the silence. And then she felt it, a cold breath against the back of her neck. Evelyn spun around, her flashlight trembling in her grip. The room was empty, but the oppressive presence was undeniable. She retreated to her desk, trying to rationalize what she'd experienced. Perhaps it was fatigue, the stress of the mansion's grim history playing tricks on her mind. She picked up her camera and reviewed the footage she had taken earlier in the day. At first, it seemed normal shots of the ornate staircase, the chandelier, the dusty rooms. But then she noticed something. In the corner of one frame, barely visible, was the faint outline of a figure. A woman, her dark gown blending into the shadows, her eyes staring directly at the camera. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She rewound the footage and played it again. The figure was gone. A sudden bang from the hallway made her jump, the sound reverberating through the mansion. Evelyn grabbed her flashlight and hesitated at the doorway. The logical part of her screamed to leave, to call for help. But her academic curiosity compelled her forward. The hallway was empty, but the scent of lavender was overwhelming now. It seemed to guide her toward a door she hadn't noticed before, hidden in the paneling. She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she reached for the handle. The whispers began softly at first, like a breeze rustling through leaves. But as she turned the knob, they grew louder, distinct words forming in the chaos. "Don't open it." Evelyn pulled back, her heart racing. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, torn between her fear and her desire for answers. Finally, she turned the knob. Evelyn's resolve was firm as she ventured deeper into the Lalaurie mansion. The unsettling events of the previous night had shaken her, but the historian in her refused to back down. This house was more than a monument to cruelty, it was a living artifact. She convinced herself that every creak, shadow, and whisper was simply the weight of history pressing against her rational mind. She spent the morning cataloging architectural details. The ornate woodwork, The intricate plaster ceilings, and the curiously asymmetrical layout of certain rooms all hinted at deliberate, albeit strange, design choices. Evelyn noted these quirks in her journal, brushing off the oppressive silence that filled the mansion. But as the day wore on, the silence became harder to ignore. It was as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting. While examining a second-floor bedroom, Evelyn noticed a loose floorboard near the window. Curiosity piqued, she pried it open with a crowbar she'd brought for her explorations. Beneath the board was a bundle of faded letters, tied with a ribbon. She carefully untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was elegant but rushed, the ink smudged in places. "They will find me soon. I can hear them searching, their footsteps heavy above me. If anyone reads this, know that I tried to escape, but she will not let me go. She is always watching." Evelyn's heart raced as she read the rest of the letters. Each one told a fragment of a story, desperate pleas for help, confessions of unspeakable deeds, and chilling descriptions of the house's otherworldly power. One letter ended abruptly, with the words, "The mirrors. Don't look in the..." The writing trailed off, the ink smeared violently across the page. Evelyn folded the letters and placed them in her bag. She glanced at the mirror above the bedroom dresser, its surface darkened with age. A fleeting movement caught her eye, a shadow darting across the glass. She spun around, but the room was empty. "Get a grip," she muttered under her breath. By nightfall, the mansion's atmosphere had shifted again. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the once grand chandelier in the foyer seemed to sway slightly, though there was no breeze. Evelyn retreated to the parlor to review her findings, lighting a few candles to keep the oppressive darkness at bay. As she reviewed the letters, a faint noise broke the silence. It was a rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming against wood. Evelyn paused, straining to hear. The tapping grew louder, echoing from the hallway. Her stomach twisted as she realized the pattern was deliberate: 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. It was coming closer. Gripping her flashlight, Evelyn crept toward the sound. The hallway stretched before her, its walls lined with faded portraits. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, raspy whisper. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. She inched forward, her flashlight beam darting across the portraits. The painted eyes seemed to follow her, their expressions frozen in subtle grimaces. Evelyn's breath hitched as one portrait, a stern-looking man in a waistcoat, suddenly shifted. The image itself didn't move, but the glass covering it cracked violently, as if struck from within. Evelyn stumbled back, nearly dropping her flashlight. Her logical mind fought to explain it away. Perhaps the old glass had finally given out. But deep down, she knew better. As she continued her investigation, the mansion seemed to grow restless. The once still air now carried faint murmurs, impossible to pinpoint. Evelyn tried to focus, forcing herself to read another journal she'd found earlier in the attic. The journal belonged to a former servant of the Lalaurie household. The entries detailed the day-to-day operations of the mansion, but they also hinted at something darker. "Madam insists the screams be muffled. She says they upset the guests. I dare not question her, for I have seen what happens to those who disobey. She is kind to the visitors, but we, her staff, know the truth. We are her tools, her pawns in some macabre game." The final entry was dated the day the mansion had burned. "The house knows. It sees everything. When the fire started, it was as if it awakened. I cannot stay here any longer. To anyone who finds this, leave. Leave while you still can." Evelyn snapped the journal shut, her pulse racing. The warnings, the letters, the strange occurrences, it was all building to something she couldn't yet grasp. A loud crash from the hallway jolted her out of her thoughts. She bolted upright, her flashlight casting wild shadows on the walls. She cautiously stepped into the hall, her heart pounding in her chest. The crash had come from the far end, near the grand staircase. As she approached, she saw shards of glass scattered across the floor. The large mirror that hung at the landing had shattered. Evelyn shone her flashlight over the fragments. Her reflection stared back at her from countless jagged pieces, but something was wrong. In the largest shard, her reflection didn't mimic her movements. Instead, it stared straight at her, its mouth curling into a sinister smile. Her blood ran cold as the reflection mouthed words she couldn't hear. Before she could react, a shadow moved behind her in the broken glass. She spun around, but the hallway was empty. A sudden wave of nausea hit her, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They seemed to seep from the walls, the floor, even the very air around her. Evelyn. The voice was unmistakable. It wasn't just any whisper, it was her own name. Evelyn awoke the next morning with a headache and a deep unease she couldn't shake. The mansion's eerie silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the occasional groan of old wood settling. She went about her routine, setting up her recording equipment in the parlor to document her findings from the attic. The journals she found the previous night were spread across the desk, their brittle pages threatening to crumble under her careful touch. Madame Lalaurie's handwriting was meticulous, each word crafted with precision. Evelyn read over more entries, and a pattern emerged: mentions of unseen watchers and whispers that never end. One entry caught her attention. "They know my secrets. They try to speak, but I silence them. Yet, I feel their eyes, even when I sleep. Always watching, always waiting." Evelyn frowned. These words seemed less like the musings of a cruel mistress and more like the ramblings of someone haunted. But haunted by what? The question lingered in her mind as she ventured back upstairs to continue her exploration. The attic was just as she'd left it, the chest of journals now sitting open like a wound. Evelyn shivered, feeling the cold that seemed to radiate from the walls themselves. As she sifted through more items, she found a tarnished silver mirror wrapped in yellowed linen. The glass was cloudy, and the ornate frame was decorated with engravings of unfamiliar symbols. Evelyn held it up to inspect her reflection, but instead of her own face, she saw something else: a fleeting shadow moving behind her. She spun around, but the attic was empty. Her pulse quickened as she studied the mirror again. This time, her reflection stared back, but the unease lingered. She wrapped the mirror back in its cloth and set it aside, deciding to catalog it later. Just as she was about to leave, a faint sound caught her attention. It was soft, almost imperceptible, like the distant hum of a lullaby. Evelyn froze, straining to hear. The sound seemed to come from beneath her feet. She crouched down, pressing her ear to the floorboards. The melody grew louder, a haunting tune that sent chills racing down her spine. It was coming from below the attic, but there was no staircase leading further down. Evelyn grabbed her flashlight and made her way to the second floor. She searched every room, feeling along the walls and floorboards for anything that might lead to a hidden space. Her persistence paid off when she noticed a slight draft coming from behind a large armoire. Pushing the heavy furniture aside, Evelyn revealed a narrow door, its edges sealed with layers of paint. She hesitated, her academic curiosity warring with a growing sense of dread. Finally, she pried the door open, revealing a narrow spiral staircase descending into darkness. The air grew colder as she descended, and the melody grew louder, echoing off the damp stone walls. The staircase ended in a small, dimly lit chamber. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars containing strange, unidentifiable objects. In the center of the room stood a table, its surface etched with the same symbols as the mirror frame. Evelyn's flashlight illuminated what appeared to be a ledger resting on the table. Its pages were filled with names, dozens, maybe hundreds. Beside each name was a date and a brief description: runaway, defiant, uncooperative. Evelyn's breath caught as she realized what she was looking at. These were records. Records of people who had been brought here and never left. Suddenly, the melody stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive. Evelyn felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She wasn't alone. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, slow and deliberate. She spun around, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. But no one was there. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. No response. The footsteps resumed, circling her. Evelyn's heart pounded as she backed against the table. The jars on the shelves began to rattle, their contents shifting as if disturbed by an unseen force. A low whisper filled the room, growing louder and more insistent. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping and unintelligible. Evelyn clapped her hands over her ears, but the whispers seemed to come from inside her head. "Stop it," she screamed. The whispers ceased instantly. The room was silent again, but the oppressive presence remained. Evelyn felt a cold breath on the back of her neck, and when she turned, she came face to face with the figure from the mirror. Its hollow eyes stared into hers, and its lips twisted into a cruel smile. Evelyn stumbled back, knocking over a jar that shattered on the floor. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the room, suffocating her. Evelyn grabbed the ledger and bolted up the stairs, her flashlight flickering wildly. She reached the second floor and slammed the hidden door shut, shoving the armoire back into place. Panting, she collapsed against the wall, clutching the ledger. But the whispers returned, this time coming from every corner of the house. "You found us. She's coming. Run." Evelyn's mind raced as the mansion seemed to come alive around her. The walls groaned, and the floor beneath her feet began to tremble. She had come here seeking answers, but now it was clear this place didn't want her to leave. The melody began again, louder this time, filling the house with its haunting tune. Evelyn bolted for the front door, but as she reached for the handle, it turned on its own and slammed shut. Evelyn's arrival at the Lalaurie mansion stirred an immediate sense of unease. It wasn't the towering iron gates or the crumbling facade of the mansion that unnerved her. She had expected those. It was the silence. The kind of heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to swallow all sound the moment she stepped onto the property. The house loomed above her, its windows like dark, watchful eyes. For Evelyn, this wasn't just another historical site. It was a treasure trove of forgotten stories, buried secrets, and grim truths waiting to be unearthed. She had read everything about Madame Lalaurie, her opulent lifestyle, her unthinkable cruelty, and the fiery destruction of her carefully constructed facade when the truth emerged. As an academic, Evelyn prided herself on her objectivity. Stories of hauntings and lingering spirits were folklore to her, sensationalized accounts meant to frighten and entertain. But stepping into the mansion, she couldn't ignore the weight of its history pressing down on her. Her first night was uneventful but restless. The grand parlor, where she had chosen to work, felt too quiet. Every creak of the wooden floorboards echoed through the cavernous halls. She found herself looking over her shoulder more than once, though she told herself it was nothing more than her imagination reacting to the stories she had read. The second night was different. Evelyn had spent the day examining some of the mansion's architectural oddities, a series of false walls and hidden compartments scattered throughout the house. In one such compartment, tucked behind the ornate mantelpiece in the dining room, she discovered a collection of tarnished silver spoons and a bundle of rotted cloth that crumbled at her touch. That night, as she reviewed her notes, the atmosphere in the mansion shifted. The air felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. The faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway outside the parlor, steady and deliberate. Evelyn froze, her pen hovering over her notebook. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing back at her. No answer. She stood, her chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor, and grabbed her flashlight. As she stepped into the hallway, the footsteps stopped. The beam of her flashlight swept over the empty corridor, illuminating peeling wallpaper and dusty chandeliers. It's just the house settling, she told herself. But deep down, she didn't believe it. She returned to her desk, determined to focus on her research. But as she flipped through a collection of old photographs she had brought with her, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. In one of the photos, taken in the main hallway of the mansion, a faint shape stood in the background, a blurred figure partially obscured by shadow. Evelyn's stomach dropped. She had taken the photo earlier that day, and she had been alone. A sudden chill swept through the room, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She turned slowly, expecting to see nothing, but her breath caught when her flashlight flickered and revealed a faint imprint of a hand on the frosted window pane behind her. She hadn't touched the window. Evelyn's logical mind worked overtime, trying to rationalize the phenomenon. A draft? Condensation? But the print was too distinct, too human. The sound of footsteps returned, this time closer. They were coming from upstairs. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, but her curiosity won out. Armed with her flashlight and a notebook, she climbed the grand staircase, each step creaking beneath her weight. The second floor was even colder than the first, the air tinged with a faint metallic smell. As she turned the corner, she saw a door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. A soft glow seeped through the crack, flickering like candlelight. Evelyn's heart pounded as she approached the door. It wasn't just fear, it was anticipation. Whatever lay beyond that door might be the key to unlocking the mansion's mysteries. She pushed it open, revealing a small, cluttered room. The source of the light was an old candelabra sitting on a table in the center of the room, its candles burning brightly. But what caught her attention was the mirror on the far wall. It was massive, its gilded frame tarnished with age, and its surface was cloudy, as though obscured by a thin layer of mist. Evelyn stepped closer, her reflection distorted and fragmented. And then, she saw it. A figure stood behind her, barely visible in the misty surface of the mirror. It was a woman, her features sharp and regal, dressed in a dark, flowing gown. Evelyn spun around, but the room was empty. Her gaze darted back to the mirror. The figure was still there, closer now, its hollow eyes staring directly at her. The door slammed shut behind her, and the candles extinguished simultaneously, plunging the room into darkness. Evelyn's flashlight flickered to life, but its beam barely pierced the oppressive blackness. A voice, low and whispering, echoed in her ear. "You shouldn't have come." Evelyn stumbled backward, her heart racing. The shadows in the room seemed to move, shifting and coalescing into shapes that writhed and reached for her. She fled, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls as she made her way back to the parlor. But when she arrived, she froze. The doll she had found earlier was sitting on her desk, its cracked face turned toward her. Beside it was another note, written in the same elegant hand. "She sees you now." Evelyn tried to suppress the gnawing unease that crept up her spine as the hours ticked by. She convinced herself that the noises, the faint whispers, the creaking floorboards, the distant tapping were merely her mind playing tricks on her. The mansion was old, after all. Old buildings had a way of feeling alive, she reasoned, as though their walls retained the memories of their past. Still, she couldn't ignore how the air grew colder the longer she stayed. The draft, perhaps. A broken window. Yet every window she checked was sealed tightly, the glass coated in a fine layer of grime. By her third night in the mansion, Evelyn's nerves were frayed. She had spent hours poring over the journals she'd found, uncovering chilling glimpses of Madame Lalaurie's life. What disturbed her most weren't the entries about the grand parties or even the accounts of punishments dealt to the staff. It was the way the writing changed, elegant script evolving into erratic scrawls. "The walls speak to me now. They know what I have done. They see everything. They are watching." Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were watching her, too. She decided to take a break, hoping the stillness of the night would calm her racing thoughts. Grabbing her flashlight, she wandered the mansion, exploring its labyrinth of rooms. She mapped out every inch in her mind: the grand staircase with its intricately carved banister, the musty library filled with rotting tomes, the kitchen with its rusted appliances and blackened hearth. But it was the third-floor hallway that unsettled her the most. The long corridor stretched into the darkness, lined with doors that led to rooms long abandoned. Each door seemed to loom over her, their warped wood and tarnished brass knobs radiating a quiet menace. As Evelyn passed the doors, she couldn't shake the sensation that something was moving behind them. She paused at one in particular, the door to what she knew had been Madame Lalaurie's private chambers. The wood was darker than the others, its surface adorned with strange, shallow gouges that almost looked like claw marks. She turned the knob slowly. The door groaned on its hinges, revealing a room frozen in time. Dust coated every surface, from the ornate four-poster bed to the cracked vanity mirror. A faded portrait of Madame Lalaurie hung crookedly on the wall, her painted eyes seeming to follow Evelyn as she stepped inside. As she moved toward the vanity, Evelyn's flashlight flickered. She tapped it, the beam steadying briefly before dimming again. In the brief flashes of light, the mirror reflected something that wasn't there: a shadowy figure standing directly behind her. Evelyn spun around, the flashlight jerking in her trembling hands. The room was empty. "Get a grip," she whispered to herself, her voice thin and shaky. Her gaze returned to the mirror, and this time, it showed only her own pale reflection. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Evelyn screamed, her hands fumbling for the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew heavier, pressing against her chest like an invisible weight. She felt a vibration beneath her feet, a low hum that rose steadily into a deep, resonant groan. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking. A faint whisper answered her, barely audible. "You shouldn't have come." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She yanked on the door with all her strength, and just as the whispers grew louder, it flew open. She stumbled into the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs. The corridor was pitch black now, her flashlight barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. She hurried back toward the stairs, her footsteps echoing loudly. But the echoes weren't hers alone. Another set of footsteps followed, heavier and deliberate. Evelyn stopped at the top of the staircase, her breath caught in her throat. The footsteps stopped, too. She turned slowly, the flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the hallway behind her. Nothing. But the air was wrong, thicker, colder, alive with a presence she couldn't see. Evelyn forced herself to descend the stairs, each creak of the wooden steps amplifying the tension. Halfway down, the whispers started again, louder this time and more distinct. "Leave. She's coming. We warned you." Evelyn froze. The voices didn't come from one direction, they surrounded her, emanating from the very walls of the mansion. She gripped the banister, her knuckles white. The chandelier above the foyer swayed gently, its crystals tinkling softly. Then it jerked violently, swinging like a pendulum. Evelyn's eyes widened as she realized it wasn't the wind, it was something else. As she reached the bottom step, she felt a cold hand brush against her shoulder. She whipped around, shining her flashlight behind her, but nothing was there. The whispers turned to laughter, faint and mocking, echoing in the cavernous foyer. Panicked, Evelyn bolted for the parlor where she had set up her desk. The doll she had left in the attic was sitting on her chair, its cracked face turned toward her. A new note rested in its lap, the ink still wet. "You belong to us now." Evelyn's scream echoed through the mansion, swallowed quickly by the oppressive darkness. The laughter grew louder, blending into a cacophony of sobs and anguished wails. The walls seemed to pulse, the room spinning as her vision blurred. And then everything went silent. Evelyn stood alone in the parlor, trembling. She clutched her chest, her breaths shallow and ragged. The doll was gone, and the note had vanished with it. The mansion was quiet again, but Evelyn knew she was no longer alone. Evelyn's hands trembled as she carefully leafed through the brittle pages of Madame Lalaurie's journals. The accounts she read were worse than the rumors she had dismissed as exaggerations. Each word painted a vivid picture of calculated cruelty, detailing not just the punishments inflicted on enslaved individuals but the twisted experiments Madame Lalaurie had conducted in the name of her own perverse curiosity. Pain reveals the truth of the soul, one entry read, chilling Evelyn to her core. Hours passed as Evelyn delved deeper into the journals. Her historian's mind catalogued the information, trying to make sense of it all. The accounts weren't just personal, they were instructional, as if Madame Lalaurie had intended for someone to continue her work. The weight of her discovery gnawed at her, but it also fed her academic obsession. This was history, dark, horrific, but undeniably real. She had to know more. That night, the mansion's atmosphere grew heavier, oppressive. Evelyn set up her equipment in the parlor to document her findings. Her audio recorder captured faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, words just out of reach. She marked it as an anomaly, though she couldn't ignore the rising unease in her chest. Her focus was broken by the sound of footsteps echoing above her. Slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to be anything but human. Evelyn grabbed her flashlight and followed the sound, her every instinct screaming at her to turn back. The footsteps led her to the second-floor hallway, where the faint smell of smoke hung in the air. She shone her flashlight down the corridor, its beam illuminating the ornate wallpaper, peeling with age. The footsteps stopped suddenly, leaving only silence. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound calm. No answer. Evelyn pushed open the nearest door, revealing a bedroom that had been untouched for decades. Dust coated the furniture, and cobwebs stretched across the corners of the room. On the bed sat a single object, a leather-bound book that hadn't been there earlier in the day. She approached it cautiously, her breath hitching as she opened the cover. The book wasn't a journal, it was a ledger, detailing the names of those who had suffered under Madame Lalaurie's rule. Pages upon pages listed names, ages, and grim fates written in meticulous handwriting. Evelyn's fingers brushed against the final page, which bore no names but a single sentence written in crimson ink. "They will not rest." The room suddenly grew colder, the air thick with an unexplainable energy. Evelyn turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her. Her flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. A whisper broke the silence, faint but distinct. "Why did you come here?" Evelyn spun around, but the room was empty. Her heart pounded as she jiggled the doorknob, desperate to escape. The door wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, joined by the sound of faint sobbing. Evelyn pressed herself against the wall, her mind racing. She was a historian, not a ghost hunter. She wasn't supposed to be part of this. Suddenly, the sobbing stopped, replaced by the soft creak of floorboards. Evelyn's flashlight went out, plunging the room into darkness. She fumbled with the light, her hands shaking, and when it finally flickered back on, she wished it hadn't. Standing in the far corner of the room was a figure, a woman in a dark dress, her face obscured by a veil. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, its presence suffocating. Evelyn's rational mind screamed for an explanation, but her body was frozen in fear. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at her. The whispers returned, now deafening, their words overlapping in an incomprehensible chorus. In a blind panic, Evelyn threw open the ledger, clutching it like a shield. The moment she did, the whispers stopped. The room fell silent, the oppressive presence lifting slightly. The door creaked open on its own. Evelyn didn't wait to question it. She bolted from the room, the ledger clutched tightly against her chest. Back in the parlor, she tried to calm herself, poring over the ledger for answers. Each name, Each detail felt like a thread pulling her deeper into the mansion's horrifying past. But the deeper she dug, the more she felt the house pushing back. She heard faint laughter echoing from the hallway, followed by the sound of dragging chains. Her candle flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. She saw movement out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned, there was nothing there. Evelyn gritted her teeth, determined to push through her fear. She was here for answers, and she wouldn't leave until she had them. But as she turned back to her work, she realized she wasn't alone. The doll was on the table again, its cracked face staring directly at her. Another note was tucked into its arms. "You were warned." The temperature in the room plummeted. Evelyn's breath came out in visible puffs as she backed away. The chandelier above her began to sway, the creaking chains echoing through the room. For the first time, Evelyn questioned whether she should have ever stepped foot inside the mansion. Evelyn Lockhart's professional curiosity was her greatest strength and her most dangerous flaw. The journals she discovered in the attic were unlike anything she'd encountered in her research, raw, intimate accounts from a time when life within the Lalaurie mansion was anything but ordinary. Each entry she read seemed to weave a tighter thread around her, pulling her deeper into the horrifying tapestry of the past. The journals hinted at hidden rooms and concealed passages, places that even the mansion's modern-day caretakers had never mentioned. Evelyn couldn't resist investigating further. She told herself it was purely academic, a chance to unearth secrets that would make her the definitive voice on Delphine Lalaurie. The first discovery came when she noticed discrepancies between the mansion's floor plans and its actual layout. A room marked as storage on the plans had no visible entrance. Evelyn combed through the journals for clues until one entry stood out. "The heart of the house hides its secrets well. Only those who seek with unclouded intent will find the way." Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she was being led not by logic, but by the mansion itself. That night, armed with a flashlight and a growing sense of determination, she returned to the attic. The attic was stifling, the air thick and unmoving. Her flashlight beam illuminated the aged wooden beams, piles of forgotten belongings, and layers of dust undisturbed for decades. But something felt different. The space seemed smaller, more oppressive, as if the walls were closing in. She focused her search on the far wall, where the journals hinted at a hidden mechanism. After hours of tapping and pressing on the wood paneling, Evelyn's hand finally brushed over a loose board. It shifted slightly under her touch, revealing a small compartment. Inside was a rusted key, its intricate design far older than the house itself. Evelyn's pulse quickened. Clutching the key, she returned to the second floor, where she had found a locked door earlier in her exploration. The key fit perfectly, and with a hesitant turn, the lock clicked. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward. The air that wafted up from below was frigid, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that made Evelyn's stomach churn. But she couldn't stop now. The staircase led to a hidden chamber, one not listed on any map or record. The room was dimly lit by an eerie, greenish glow that emanated from old lanterns hung on the walls. The space was lined with iron cages, their bars warped and rusted with age. Chains dangled from the ceiling, their ends crusted with what Evelyn refused to believe was dried blood. On a table in the center of the room lay an array of crude tools, hammers, blades, and implements Evelyn couldn't even name. Her mind raced as she tried to rationalize what she was seeing. This had to be some sort of historical display, she thought, set up by someone with a morbid sense of humor. But the air in the room carried an undeniable weight, as if the space itself was alive with the memory of suffering. A sudden sound shattered the silence, a faint whisper, barely audible. "Help us." Evelyn froze, her flashlight trembling in her grip. The voice was so soft she couldn't be sure she'd heard it at all. But as she scanned the room, her light caught movement, a fleeting shadow that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. "Who's there?" she called, her voice breaking. No response. Her rational mind told her to leave, to seal the door and forget she'd ever found it. but her curiosity overruled her fear. She stepped further into the room, her footsteps echoing on the cold stone floor. In the far corner, she spotted something unusual, a collection of items laid out as if in tribute. There was a cracked mirror, a child's shoe, and a lock of hair tied with a faded ribbon. Each object seemed mundane, yet profoundly out of place. Evelyn crouched to examine the mirror. Its surface was dull, but as she turned it toward her face, she gasped. For a split second, she saw not her own reflection, but that of a gaunt, wide-eyed woman whose face was contorted in terror. The image vanished, leaving only Evelyn's pale, shaken face staring back. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a chain on the floor. The whispers returned, louder this time. They seemed to come from every direction, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of pleas and warnings. Don't let her find you. Leave while you can. She knows you're here. The temperature dropped sharply, and Evelyn's breath became visible in the air. The lanterns flickered, their eerie light casting dancing shadows on the walls. And then, from the staircase behind her, came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. Evelyn turned, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The footsteps grew louder, descending the hidden staircase with an unrelenting rhythm. She aimed her flashlight at the doorway, but the beam revealed nothing. "Who's there?" she shouted, though she wasn't sure she wanted an answer. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, in the faint glow of the lanterns, a figure began to emerge. It was shrouded in darkness, its form shifting like smoke. Evelyn's body refused to move as the figure stepped closer, the outline of a woman taking shape. The apparition raised its head, and Evelyn saw the unmistakable face of Madame Delphine Lalaurie, beautiful, cruel, and filled with an unnatural rage. Her eyes locked onto Evelyn, and a chilling smile spread across her face. "You seek the truth," the specter said, her voice like a blade slicing through the air. "But can you bear it?" The lanterns flickered violently, and the room plunged into darkness. Evelyn's screams were swallowed by the mansion, her flashlight clattering to the floor as the shadows consumed her. Evelyn Lockhart sat in the dimly lit parlor of the Lalaurie mansion, a stack of carefully preserved documents spread before her. As a historian, she was accustomed to piecing together the fragments of the past, but this was different. This house, this project seemed to resist her efforts at every turn. The journals she had found in the attic were the kind of discovery historians dreamed of, first-hand accounts from Delphine Lalaurie herself. Yet, as Evelyn read through the faded pages, a strange unease began to creep over her. The language was disturbingly vivid, the descriptions of punishments and experiments almost too detailed to be real. Evelyn shook her head, reminding herself that she was here to uncover the truth, not to be swayed by the ghost stories whispered by locals. The mansion's reputation as one of the most haunted places in America had always felt like an embellishment, a way to attract tourists. But now, as the night deepened and the mansion's oppressive silence pressed in, she couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to it. She leaned closer to the journal, her eyes scanning an entry dated April 12, 1834. "Today, I discovered something extraordinary, a way to silence their screams. The key lies not in their bodies but in their spirits. This house holds them now, binds them to me. They cannot leave, and neither shall I." Evelyn's breath caught. The words were chilling, but what did they mean? Had Delphine truly believed she had bound the souls of her victims to the house? She closed the journal and reached for her notebook, jotting down observations. As she wrote, a sudden gust of cold air swept through the room, extinguishing the single candle she had lit. Evelyn froze, her pen hovering above the page. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the creaking of the old house seemed to pause, as if it were holding its breath. "Just a draft," Evelyn muttered, though her voice sounded small and unconvincing. She fumbled for her flashlight and swept its beam across the room. The light caught the edges of antique furniture and dusty drapes but revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Deciding to call it a night, Evelyn gathered her things and made her way to the staircase. As she ascended, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from above. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling slightly. The footsteps stopped. Evelyn swallowed hard. She wasn't alone in the mansion. Reaching the second floor, she shone her flashlight down the hallway. The beam of light landed on a door at the far end, a door she was certain had been closed earlier. Now it stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. She approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. Pushing the door open, she found herself in what appeared to be a nursery. The air was colder here, and the faint scent of lavender lingered. A rocking chair sat in the corner, its wooden frame polished smooth by time. On the seat lay a small bundle of blanket wrapped tightly around something. Evelyn hesitated before stepping closer. With trembling hands, she pulled back the blanket to reveal a porcelain doll, its face cracked and eyes gleaming unnaturally in the flashlight's beam. She gasped, dropping the blanket. The doll tumbled to the floor, landing with a hollow thud. Suddenly, the rocking chair began to move. Evelyn stumbled backward, her flashlight shaking as she shone it toward the chair. It creaked slowly back and forth, though no one was there to push it. A low whisper filled the room, indistinct at first but growing clearer with each passing second. "Get out." The voice was barely audible, yet it sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. She turned and bolted from the room, slamming the door behind her. Downstairs, she tried to collect her thoughts. Her rational mind told her it was exhaustion, that she was imagining things. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. Determined to make sense of what was happening, Evelyn decided to review the journals again. She flipped through the pages, searching for anything that might explain the strange occurrences. Her fingers stopped on a passage near the end. "I have left my mark on this house, and it has left its mark on me. Even in death, I shall remain. They cannot escape me. None of them can." Evelyn felt the weight of the words pressing down on her. It wasn't just a house, it was a trap, a place designed to hold the souls of its victims. As the hours passed, the sounds around her grew more pronounced. The whispers returned, louder this time, accompanied by faint laughter and the occasional crash of unseen objects falling. Evelyn ventured into the basement, drawn by an inexplicable urge. The stairs groaned beneath her weight, and the air grew colder with each step. When she reached the bottom, her flashlight revealed a crude brick wall, uneven and hastily constructed. Her heart raced as she realized the bricks didn't match the rest of the mansion's architecture. It was as if someone had tried to seal something away. Grabbing a crowbar from her bag, she pried at the bricks, her curiosity outweighing her fear. The wall crumbled away, revealing a small, dark chamber. Inside were more chains, rusted and broken, and the faint outline of symbols etched into the walls. Evelyn stepped closer, her breath visible in the frigid air. The whispers grew deafening. "Why did you disturb us?" The voice came from behind her, and she spun around, her flashlight falling to the floor. In the dim light, she saw a figure pale and gaunt, its hollow eyes fixed on her. Evelyn screamed, stumbling backward into the chamber. The figure moved closer, its skeletal hand reaching out. In her panic, Evelyn tripped over a chain and fell to the ground. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing her flashlight, and shone it at the figure. It vanished, leaving only the sound of fading whispers. She fled the basement, her mind racing. Whatever she had awakened, it wasn't finished with her. The Lalaurie mansion wasn't just a historical site, it was alive, and it wanted her to stay. Evelyn's initial curiosity about the Lalaurie mansion was soon replaced by an insatiable need to uncover its buried truths. The journals she had unearthed in the attic were a historian's dream original, handwritten accounts from one of the most infamous women in New Orleans history. Yet, their content was disturbing, laced with a cruelty that seeped from every word. Evelyn told herself it was just history, a glimpse into the horrors of the past. But as the nights wore on, the line between past and present began to blur. The mansion was relentless in its attempts to unnerve her. Doors she was certain she had closed would creak open behind her. Footsteps echoed through the halls at odd hours, always just out of sight. On the third night, while poring over her notes in the parlor, Evelyn noticed something strange. The paintings on the wall seemed to shift. At first, she thought it was her tired mind playing tricks on her, but the expressions on the faces once stoic and serene became twisted, their eyes seeming to follow her movements. She resolved to distract herself by focusing on the journals. The entries grew darker the deeper she read, chronicling Madame Lalaurie's descent into madness. There were meticulous records of her experiments, human lives reduced to gruesome trials of endurance. One entry, dated mere weeks before the mansion burned in 1834, described a secret room hidden beneath the house, accessible only by a concealed staircase. "There, I perfect my art," the entry read. "The world above is too fragile to witness true genius. But below, I am free." Evelyn's pulse quickened. If the secret room existed, it would be a groundbreaking discovery, one that could cement her career. She scoured the journals for more clues and noticed repeated references to the parlor. Something about the fireplace struck her as odd. The ornate carvings didn't match the rest of the room's decor. With trembling hands, Evelyn ran her fingers along the fireplace's surface, feeling for any irregularities. Her heart leapt when she found a small, hidden latch embedded within the woodwork. She hesitated, glancing around the room as though expecting someone or something to stop her. Gathering her courage, she pulled the latch. A section of the wall beside the fireplace groaned and shifted, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that wafted up was damp and cold, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of decay. Evelyn hesitated, her logical mind warring with her curiosity. She had come this far, and she couldn't turn back now. With a flashlight in one hand and a journal in the other, she descended into the hidden chamber. Each step creaked beneath her weight, the sound echoing ominously. The staircase seemed to spiral endlessly, and the deeper she went, the colder it became. When she finally reached the bottom, she was greeted by an oppressive silence. The chamber was larger than she expected, its walls lined with shelves holding an array of macabre instruments, rusted chains, tarnished blades, and jars filled with murky, unidentifiable substances. In the center of the room stood an old wooden table, its surface stained dark with what Evelyn could only assume was blood. Her flashlight beam flickered as she moved it across the room, revealing more horrors: monocles bolted to the walls, claw marks gouged into the stone, and a faint, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate through the air. Evelyn's academic detachment began to falter. This isn't just history," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "This is wrong." Her attention was drawn to a small desk tucked into the corner. On it lay a stack of papers, yellowed with age. The handwriting was different from Madame Lalaurie's, rougher and more frantic. The notes described the chamber in chilling detail: its purpose, its victims, and the horrors inflicted upon them. One line stood out: "Their suffering binds them here. They can never leave. Neither can she." Evelyn shivered, glancing over her shoulder. The oppressive silence was broken by a faint sound: breathing. At first, she thought it was her own, but as she held her breath, the sound continued, steady and rhythmic. It was coming from the far end of the room. Her flashlight flickered again as she turned toward the source. The beam landed on a doorway partially obscured by shadows. The breathing grew louder as she approached, her every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But her curiosity pushed her forward. The doorway led to a smaller chamber, its walls covered in symbols etched deep into the stone. In the center of the room was a pit, its depths shrouded in darkness. Evelyn edged closer, her hands trembling as she shone her flashlight into the void. A face stared back at her. She stumbled backward with a scream, dropping her flashlight. The device rolled across the floor, casting wild beams of light that made the shadows dance. The face in the pit didn't move, its hollow eyes fixed on her. Evelyn scrambled to retrieve her flashlight, her heart racing. When she aimed the beam at the pit again, the face was gone. Her breathing was ragged as she backed out of the room. But as she turned, she froze. The shadows in the main chamber had shifted, forming shapes human-like figures that writhed and twisted as though in pain. "You shouldn't have come here," a voice whispered, low and guttural. Evelyn's blood ran cold. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The figures on the walls moved closer, their forms stretching and contorting. She bolted up the stairs, her flashlight barely illuminating the way. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more frantic. When she finally reached the parlor, she slammed the hidden door shut and collapsed against it, gasping for air. But the mansion wasn't done with her. As she sat there, trembling, the journal in her lap flipped open on its own, the pages turning violently. It stopped on an entry she hadn't seen before. The words seemed to glow faintly, as though written in fresh ink. "You will join us." Evelyn's mind raced, each breath catching in her chest as she faced the encroaching darkness of the hidden chamber. The cold, damp air pressed against her skin, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed ominously. The shadows seemed to thicken, coiling like serpents, closing in from all sides. Desperate, she clutched the flashlight in her trembling hands and swung it wildly, its dim beam cutting through the blackness. The glow landed on something she hadn't noticed before, an ornate iron door embedded in the far wall. It was ancient, its surface etched with symbols she couldn't decipher, and it emanated an unsettling hum, as if alive. Hope surged within her. A way out. It had to be. Evelyn stumbled toward the door, her footsteps crunching against the debris of the room, bones, broken chains, and rusted implements. Each step felt heavier, the air itself resisting her movements, but she pressed on, her academic curiosity now eclipsed by sheer survival instinct. As she reached the door, she noticed something else. Above it, carved into the stone in faded letters, were the words, "La fin du chemin." The end of the path. Her fingers hesitated over the cold iron handle, a voice in her mind screaming for her to stop. But behind her, the whispers had grown louder, the ghostly chorus swelling into an unbearable cacophony. "She's coming. It's too late. Run." Evelyn gritted her teeth, yanked the door open, and plunged through. The air on the other side was colder still, like stepping into an icy void. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening clang, and the whispers ceased instantly. For a moment, there was silence, a silence so profound that Evelyn could hear her own heartbeat, erratic and frantic. She raised her flashlight, its weak beam illuminating a narrow stone corridor. The walls were lined with ancient carving scenes of people bound in chains, faces twisted in agony, their eyes wide with terror. Evelyn's stomach churned as she moved forward, unable to shake the feeling that the figures were watching her, their carved eyes following her every step. The corridor seemed endless, twisting and turning, each bend revealing more horrifying scenes. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the space around her was absorbing the sound. Then she heard it. A slow, deliberate scraping sound, like metal dragging against stone. It was faint at first but grew louder with each passing second, reverberating off the walls. Evelyn froze, her flashlight shaking in her grip as she turned to look behind her. The corridor was empty. And yet, the sound persisted, closer now. She quickened her pace, her pulse hammering in her ears. The corridor widened into a cavernous room, and in the center stood a massive stone table, its surface stained dark with age. Chains dangled from the walls, their ends frayed and rusted. On the far side of the room was another door, smaller and unadorned. Evelyn darted toward it, but as she reached for the handle, her flashlight flickered and went out. Darkness engulfed her. "No, no, no," she whispered, fumbling with the flashlight. A new sound emerged, a soft, wet noise, like something dragging itself across the ground. It came from the center of the room. Evelyn's fingers fumbled over the flashlight, finally flicking it back on. The beam illuminated the stone table, and Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. A figure lay atop it, a woman in a tattered dress, her face obscured by a veil of matted hair. The figure twitched, her head jerking toward Evelyn with a sickening snap. The woman sat up slowly, her movements unnatural, as though she were a puppet on strings. Her hands, long and claw-like, gripped the edges of the table, and when she raised her head, Evelyn saw her face. It was Madame Delphine Lalaurie. Her features were distorted, her eyes sunk in pits of darkness, her lips twisted into a grotesque smile. She tilted her head, her voice a low, guttural rasp. "Did you think you could uncover the truth and leave?" Evelyn stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from her hand and clattering to the ground. She scrambled to pick it up, but Lalaurie was already moving toward her, her bare feet dragging across the stone. "You're part of the story now," the apparition hissed, her voice echoing unnaturally. "Stay. Join them." The chains on the walls rattled violently, and from the shadows emerged other figures, men, women, and children, their forms translucent and their faces contorted in eternal torment. They reached for Evelyn, their ghostly hands brushing against her skin, cold and numbing. Evelyn screamed, backing toward the door. She slammed her fists against it, but it wouldn't budge. The scraping sound returned, louder and closer, and when Evelyn turned, she saw Lalaurie mere inches from her, her hollow eyes burning with malice. "You cannot escape the past," Lalaurie whispered. "And you cannot escape me." The ghostly hand seized Evelyn, dragging her to the center of the room. She thrashed and screamed, but their grip was unrelenting. The last thing she saw was Lalaurie's face, triumphant and horrifying, as the shadows consumed her. The next morning, the mansion stood silent. Evelyn's belongings were found neatly arranged in the parlor, her notes meticulously organized. But she was nowhere to be seen. Tourists later swore they saw her in the upstairs window, a pale figure, her face pressed against the glass, eyes wide with terror. The Lalaurie mansion claimed another. And it waits for the next.